Hello and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is our third and final part in our three-part series looking at Reconstruction, A Nation Tries to Heal, looking at the post-Civil War America between 1865 and 1877. We've looked and discussed over these three-part series at kind of the different plans or views of how to help the country heal and bring the nation sort of back together, and how that led to a lot of conflict between the president, Andrew Johnson, and these radical Republicans in Congress. We've also looked to see the economic placements that were placed with African Americans with the sharecropping system, where you see a sort of a desire to figure out what are we going to do with all these freed slaves. Where are they going to live? What are they going to do? What kind of work are they going to have? And it unfortunately sets up a very horrible sharecropping system that kind of keeps African Americans in the South kind of in perpetual poverty. For the third part, we're going to look at is kind of the final piece of Reconstruction, and that is the end of Reconstruction. How does Reconstruction come to an end? Why is 1877 kind of that date for the end of this era? The page numbers we'll be looking at are from pages 566 to 571. Here are our guiding questions. How did the presidential election of 1876 end Reconstruction? What was the intent of the Black Codes? What was the KKK and how did it hurt African Americans' gains in Reconstruction? What was Plessy versus Ferguson and how did it bring about Jim Crow laws? What type of society did Jim Crow laws create in the South? And then what gains were made in Reconstruction and what losses are made during Reconstruction? So what brings Reconstruction to an end? Well, it actually was a presidential election that takes place in 1876. That year, there are actually two candidates running for president. There was a Republican running for office, a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes, and a Democrat named Samuel J. Tilden. And so you have an election, and again, in the presidential election, it's not the popular vote that matters, it's the, everybody say it with me, Electoral College. And it's a really disputed election. Hayes wins 165 electoral votes, and Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, wins 184 electoral votes. But there are 20 electoral votes that have been disputed. There's some elections and some shenanigans that were going on that has put those into dispute. And the key here is that the magic number in 1876 to win the presidency was 185 votes. So Tilden is just one electoral vote shy of winning the presidency in 1876, taking it out of the hands of the Republicans who had the control of the presidency since the removal of Andrew Johnson after his term expired. Grant had been sitting there, and the Republicans desperately want to keep on to their power in the presidency. So we have a constitutional crisis. We don't know who won the election. It's kind of in dispute. So a special commission was created, made up of about 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats to kind of reach a deal to try and settle this constitutional crisis. Who's the next president? Because it really was not clear at that time. So we look at the electoral map in 1876, we can see here that most of the northern states and the western states voted primarily for Republicans. The Democrats sweep the South except for 3 states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. But guess what? Those are the states that are in dispute. There are some concerns of some that thinks that there's been some vote tampering and some things that are going on there as well. Tilden, as a New Yorker, gains a lot of the upper middle colony, old middle colony regions of New York and New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, kind of the middle part of the old New England colonies or middle colonies. So we have here a rather disputed election. Tilden has won the popular vote, as we can see here, with 51% of the vote, and Hayes has only won 48%. So if we look at popular vote, it looks like Tilden wins. And if we look at kind of how close the electoral votes are, it looks like Tilden wins because he's only 1 vote shy. But Hayes ends up winning the election. So how in the world did that happen? Well, a lot of historians feel that there's some kind of informal deal kind of struck between the Republicans and the Democrats. And they kind of come up with a very interesting compromise that leaves us even today a little bit scratching our heads, like how does this work? But Hayes ends up winning the presidency. So here's another Republican in the White House. And the current president, Ulysses S. Grant, the same famed general of the Union, the Civil War hero of the Union, agrees that he will remove federal troops from southern states. Well, why is that important? Remember, the Civil War had ended in 1865. So this is 12 years after the Civil War has ended, and there are still federal soldiers that are kind of occupying the South. And that's been going on for 12 years. And a lot of Southerners were very frustrated with the fact that they were still feeling much of being under an occupation. And so they've been asking that forever. So a lot of historians feel that the Democrats sort of caved in on the election in hoping that in the long run it would by helping them get rid of the troops that are stationed in the South. The South also has promised federal funds to help in the rebuilding efforts, and Hayes makes some overtures to the Democrats saying, I'll pick some Democrats to sit in my advisors. And the Democrats say, we'll promise to protect the rights of African Americans, we'll protect their civil and their political rights in the South, which is why the federal troops, why Grant had those federal troops down there, was to protect the rights of African Americans. So why is this compromise important and marked the end of Reconstruction? For 12 years, really the only barrier between African Americans in the South and the old white leadership and establishment were these federal troops. When the federal troops leave, that pretty much means it's the end of any kind of protection of African Americans' political rights, being able to vote and hold office, as well as some of their civil rights of being treated fairly in society. So with the removal of federal troops in 1877, it's going to pretty much set us into a very different era, sometimes referred to as the Jim Crow era. And we can see from this Harper Weekly sketch here, it says worse than slavery. We have an African-American family here. They're kind of crowding on the ground. They've got a small child. We see flames going on over here. We see an African-American being lynched. And we have two people here shaking their hands. One has a pamphlet called the White League, and then we have the letters KK with a hood, which we know as the Ku Klux Klan. So a lot of the gains made in the Reconstruction era of African Americans' political and equal rights, societal rights, civil rights, are going to be kind of removed and chipped away. And we will not see federal protection of minority or African American rights really in the South again until the 1950s. So we're talking from 1877 till 1950 of this era known as the Jim Crow era, where we're going to see a lot of racism and segregation and kind of losses in terms of the gains that African Americans made out of Reconstruction. So what are some of these laws and losses? Well, one of these were called black codes, and black codes were passed during Reconstruction, so these are actually before the election. But we see as early as the beginning of Reconstruction that a lot of white Southerners are trying to maintain this power structure that leaves them in control of the society, that African Americans will not have a voice. So these are government laws passed by Southern governments, and they basically took away rights of former slaves. It said that African Americans could not work or could not meet in unsupervised groups. The fear here is that they might try to form bands and do kind of revenges or reprisals or riots. That was the reasons used to justify it. They prevented African Americans from being able to vote or serve on juries and trials. It did give them the rights to marry and own land and work for a wage, work for a salary. So there were a few things in there that gave them a few rights. But generally the black codes, the purpose of the black codes was really to keep African Americans on the bottom of the social order. It was the idea of segregation of the races, keep the whites and the blacks and separate from each other so that they would not intermingle in their society. The black codes also kind of helped set up this sharecropping system that we talked about in an earlier lecture, where planters and African American freed slaves, freedmen, could kind of help match them up so they could find where they could maybe get their work here together here. So that's one of the lasting legacies really of these ending of Reconstruction, or this kind of the passing of these black codes, which we'll kind of start seeing this idea of segregation. We also see, as you saw in that earlier picture, the rise and emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK for short. The Ku Klux Klan was basically a white terrorist group. Their beliefs were that they were the ghosts of former Confederates. They were to try to maintain what they felt was the lost cause of the Civil War, of keeping this pure white Southern society that was slave controlling. And so they used, as terrorists, fear and intimidation to drive African Americans really out of a lot of the political gains that were made in the early years of Reconstruction. Because once, as the Republicans were in charge and had military forces governing those regions, African Americans were able to vote, and they were able to elect representatives to African Americans to actually speak for them. But once the soldiers leave, the Klan sort of steps in, and they use lynchings, they use burning crosses in front of homes, assaults, beatings. In the 1890s, which is later on after Reconstruction, it's believed that an African American was maybe lynched somewhere in this country, somewhere almost every single day. So it's a pretty brutal assault the Klan uses across the South, and actually will expand into many of the northern states as well, as we'll talk about later on when we get into the 1900s and early 1900s and 1920s. With this, we also see the rise, again, of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is a reference to a minstrel show where a white actor painted themselves in blackface face paint and played kind of a buffoonish character, kind of not very smart, kind of goofy character, showing African Americans as not being very educated, not being very smart, not being very serious, kind of lazy. And that's where the term comes from. Is from these Jim Crow laws. And really these Jim Crow laws were passed kind of as a follow-up to the black codes to enforce very high segregation in society. The photograph you see up there is a famous photograph taken in the 1950s where you see a drinking fountain, of a white drinking fountain and the colored drinking fountain for African Americans. And the idea here is that we're going to separate and segregate the races. Now, the legal standing that gives them the ability to do this comes from a pretty famous Supreme Court ruling called Plessy versus Ferguson, which was ruled on by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896, where the Supreme Court ruled basically, in essence, that the governments of the country, the states, the governments can pass laws saying that you can separate, that as long as they are equal, quote unquote, that you can separate facilities and separate the races. Which is, a violation of the 14th Amendment that says that, equal protection under the law. And the court said, no, that doesn't apply here. Plessy versus Ferguson says that we can have segregation. So from 1877, and then after the Ferguson case in 1896, really up until the 1950s, we see this segregation really, especially in the South, the Deep South, where we have segregation, which is what later on we'll talk about with the Civil Rights Movement. That's one of the areas they will begin to attack, is this idea that you cannot have separate and equal. This up here is not equal. This is not the same kind of drinking fountain. But that will be established by Plessy versus Ferguson during Reconstruction. So if we think about Reconstruction, really it's kind of a beginning of a journey, or a continuation of a journey. We started with the Civil War, pre-Civil War, with the idea of slavery, where slaves had no rights. They were forced to work. They had no freedom of movement. They could not move freely across the country, only if they had special permission of their masters. Members of their family could be sold away at a whim. Families were broken apart. And obviously, slaves had no representation. They had no say in our government and no say in our society. So here we have slavery, and then now we have the Civil War and the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, ending slavery. So we get slavery banned. It's illegal now in our country. African Americans are now free to work for a salary, for a wage, earn a salary for their hard work, be paid for their labor. They have free movement. There's really not a lot of restrictions right after the Civil War that says you cannot move around. Families are reunited. Former husbands and wives and children. After the Civil War, there's a drastic effort by African Americans to try and find lost family members and loved ones. And they could elect African Americans to represent them in government. So we see here from slavery to Reconstruction, we have here some gains here. But then as we get to the end of Reconstruction, we kind of see rights being denied, where we see a sharecropping system that creates a cycle of poverty, a perpetual cycle of poverty. Voting and office holding restrictions will be put into place. Enforced by the Ku Klux Klan will be used as a terrorist organization to keep African Americans out of political control. And the old white Southern leadership of the South that was in control before the Civil War, in essence, comes back and reclaims authority back in the South. Now, this is a story that we're not done talking about. Obviously, we still have a lot of American history, over 100 years of American history still left to do. So this is still going to be an ongoing story, an ongoing discussion, as we talk about the formation of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored Persons, or the NAACP, in the early 1900s. And as we get to the end, we'll talk about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, with people like Rosa Parks and Malcolm X and Dr. King, again, looking at trying to bring about this sense of equality. So Reconstruction, the story doesn't end. It's kind of a to be continued. There's definitely going to be some elements that we'll bring back later on. So in whole, if we look at Reconstruction, we can kind of break it down into two columns. We can say there are some gains that come out of Reconstruction, some kind of positive things, and we can also say there's some losses, some things that we even are still facing and dealing with somewhat today. You get three important changes to the Constitution, three new amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Slavery is no longer legalized in this country. There is a legal slavery, but in terms of a system, there's no legal slavery. The 14th Amendment said that African Americans could be U.S. citizens. This was to correct the problem of the Dred Scott decision that said slaves could never be American citizens. The 14th Amendment says anyone born in the U.S. is going to be a natural-born citizen. They are a citizen by default. The 15th Amendment gives male African Americans the right to vote. So these are three pretty important amendments that get added to the Constitution that are still part of our framework today. Early on during Reconstruction, African Americans will make some huge gains in representation. You'll have many African Americans hold offices. It's believed that during the Reconstruction era, about 1 out of 5 office holders in local government were African Americans. You'll have them elected to sheriffs and state legislatures and city councils, and they'll have some will be even elected to Congress. 22 will be elected to the U.S. Congress. 2 will be elected to the U.S. Senate. But as we said, as Reconstruction ends and as the soldiers and the Union troops and the Northern troops, federal troops leave the South, and this kind of backlash takes place, by the end of 1877, African Americans will be pretty much driven out of having any kind of political representation here. Losses, sharecropping system is going to set up a cycle of poverty in the South among African Americans. It's going to lead to a great migration that we'll talk about later on. You've got the creation of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, using terror and intimidation tactics, and a lot of voting restrictions and that will be like a literacy test that says African Americans will have to prove that they can read and write. And these, as we'll discuss later on this year, the literacy tests were very biased, very much set up for African Americans to fail the test. And then there were poll taxes, and since African Americans were more likely to be in poverty because of sharecropping, they couldn't pay a tax to go vote. And if they couldn't vote, they couldn't have any representation. So you had the Klan working against them, you had all these voting restrictions working against them, you had all these Plessy versus Ferguson, these Jim Crow laws working against them, the black codes working against them. You had really a lot of things working against them as well. So Reconstruction really is kind of a few steps forward, but also a few steps back here definitely as well. So let's end Reconstruction here with this particular photograph. And if we think about this photograph, we see here kind of the two major sides here. We have on the one side, we have the old white establishment, this idea that this is a white society, America is a white country for whites only, and you have now newly freed African Americans trying to find their place in the society, fighting and struggling for equality and a chance to be successful in American society. And then we have here, those Union troops in the South kind of trying to keep that peace, keep that balance. But as soon as they leave, that it's going to lead to some violence and some pushback. in the South, and will bring us into some topics for us later on in the year as we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, which will be another very important mark in American history. So that's Reconstruction. It ended not as it began, under a lot of hope and optimism, especially among many Northern Republicans, to try to bring in African Americans into the Union and as voting members. But eventually, in 12 years of Reconstruction, both sides are ready to move on, and things just kind of go back the way almost they were before the Civil War in terms of who kind of runs the South, which is going to lead to years of segregation and racism and problems in the South. So hope you enjoyed listening to this video lecture. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please come talk to your teacher. Hope these help you study for your assessments. Thank you for listening.